Welcome to the Catch 'em and Keep 'em podcast with Melissa, Glenny and Mark Altman. We're here to help you hire, engage, and retain the best talent to help you make your vision a reality.
Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Catch 'em, Keep 'em. Melissa, Glenny, and I are happy to be back. And I got to tell you, this episode, you need to be paying close attention because Melissa is going to touch upon something that is just flat out a universal problem for companies of all sizes all over the country. And that's why the top 8% of salespeople won't join your team and what you can do about it. And I got to tell you, Melissa, I'm going to be all ears because I know this is a challenge for my own organization. So Melissa, great to be back with you.
Yeah, great to be back with you, Mark. I'm excited to talk about this because I share your pain. It's been one of the biggest challenges for mine as well. So glad to dive in.
So Melissa, you know, so many employers are struggling in this area. And so it would seem obvious, but why have you found a niche with sales reps? Why have you found kind of the secret sauce to do this?
Well, you know, Mark, I chose to focus on specifically sales reps because almost 13% of all jobs in the U.S., that's 1 in 8, are full-time sales positions. So there's a large population of sales reps, and it's hard to find the good candidates. It's extremely hard to find the good ones, especially with the demand being so high. So it takes a comprehensive strategy and a lot of effort to hire the best ones.
Melissa, you know, when you're finding those candidates, is there any kind of red flag or deal breaker, just something from your experience, you know, right out of the gate that as you're evaluating and qualifying candidates for companies that you specifically look out for?
Well, you know, I got pretty early on in the process. I have a method for questioning sales reps, and it seems as though I've been able to do it in such a way where they don't know where I'm going. It's funny. It's really funny in the conversation where I can sense that they've just discovered where I'm going, and they better have been truthful about, you know, because I'll start out with, you know, what their sales cycles are like and volume and prices and gross profit. And so it's all very just light and like, oh, interesting. Okay. And then when it comes down to talk quota, I know I can do math. So I just get that out of the way and make sure somebody is, number one, honest. That's number one.
Well, and I have to tell you, Melissa, you and I have had a lot of conversations about when sales reps underperform, it can be a multitude of reasons. However, we both have agreed that very often it's because they weren't assessed effectively in the hiring process. So, you know, you've been on top of that since day one. So talk about, you know, your thoughts on that and how you've approached that a little differently.
Well, yeah, I think assessments are important. And, you know, you're right about that. I've worked with a lot of companies who hire salespeople based on the soft skills that they observe in the interview, that person's outgoing, upbeat, good conversational skills, they, you know, appear motivated and confident. So the hiring managers get excited and then they don't carry on to do their full due diligence. And, you know, studies show that I think it's somewhere around 50 or 55% of people are making their living in sales, but they don't have the right skills to be successful. And I think that's what kind of comes through, and that's why sometimes it just feels like, you know, for lack of a better way of saying it, a crapshoot when companies are hiring salespeople, because, you know, some work out, and it seems like an equal amount don't work out, or sometimes an even greater amount don't work out. So, you know, I think there's the reason that I focus on the top 8% of salespeople is, well, let me ask you this question, Mark. Out of all the sales revenue generated in the United States across all industries, how much of that sales revenue would you say is generated by the top 8% of sales reps?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is the 80-20 rule, but I really don't know. I would have defaulted to that.
Yeah, and you know, I think I'd be in the same boat with you. I would go to that too. So the numbers show that the top 8% of sales reps actually are producing 80% of all sales generated. Wow. So I think in essence, you've got it. So that the 80% is accurate. So I know that you can do math too, but I just have to state it the other way. That's 92% of sales reps that are collectively producing 20% of sales.
Melissa, let me ask
So
you, continue, please. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. I'm like, so that's the pool, right? So
Yep.
hence the reason it's so difficult.
Well, so let me ask you, you got me thinking when you said that. I feel a lot of companies have a budget for their sales team, and they're given certain numbers by whether it's an executive board, whether it's investors, whatever it is, certain numbers that they need to meet. And even with the statistic you just shared, which is really compelling, I wonder if sometimes, companies aren't doing enough due diligence during the hiring process because they just feel like they need to get bodies in there. Because even if those bodies generate 20%, it still helps companies achieve their goals. So are you seeing companies maybe not do enough due diligence during the hiring process just because they're trying to fill quotas?
Well, I think that one common methodology that I've seen for the last couple of decades is companies just kind of understanding. They kind of adapt this mentality that it's a numbers game, and so they'll hire 4 or 5, maybe 6 reps, realizing they really only need to retain 1 or 2, and then it's survival of the fittest. So 90 days or 6 months, whatever the timeline is. They'll just flush out the people who aren't performing as well as the 1 or 2 that they want to keep. So it's sort of throwing mud against the wall method of going about it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really common, and I have a problem with it because, I think that I look at there's financial aspects. You're obviously paying a lot of training dollars. The time it takes to acclimate. A lot of people to acclimate, and it's not just the salary of the person that you're paying who's going to churn in 90 days or whatnot. It's the investment of everyone else in the company. And then there's the aspect of goodwill and your reputation as a company. If you're churning people in and out, then what are those people who are churning out saying about you? And now you're hurting your chances of hiring top talent. So, I think that's why I highlight that as something that I don't think is an ideal practice.
Well, and one of my big curiosities in this call is it can be hard enough to attract even decent salespeople, never mind top tier talent. So how are you able to do that for companies and really get that top 8%? How are you able to pull that off?
Well, I think that there's 3 things that I would speak to on that. I think number one, I heard you say it before, and I completely agree that hope is not a strategy. You put out job postings and kind of hope that the good candidates come your way. You've got to really have a strategy with strategic partnerships, referral bonuses, recruiting plans. In today's recruitment environment, that means you have technology in place to support the recruitment. And if you don't have the technology, then that's definitely something that can be supplemented by having the appropriate strategic partnerships. I'm referring to recruiters or agencies. So I think that that's foundational. And then realize that it's a continual process. It's not an event. So, I know we brought up Glenn Ross before, and I'll adapt that because I have a saying in my business, always be courting. And what I mean is always be identifying the top players in your industry or in your market and essentially be marketing to them and building a relationship with them before you need them. So I recommend doing things like, maybe measuring talent pipelines with hiring managers and working it into their compensation as a KPI because what gets measured gets managed. So, for example, having hiring managers have X number of interviews per week, month, quarter, depending on the level of hiring that they need to be doing, and then tying it off with a measurement of the time to fill when there is an open rec. So, really managing the process. Aside from that, I think it's really important. We talked about employer branding, and I feel like I'm just, beating that drum continuously, but there's a reason for it. Companies really need to have employer branding that echoes the skills and the attitudes that they need. A lot of companies, I think, jumped on the employer branding bandwagon, but they've done so in such a way that's not always the most effective. My point there is that it's not about like painting this picture of blue sky and like rainbows and butterflies or beer and ping pong all day, whatever that may look like. It's really about being honest about your company culture and attracting people who have the personality and the attributes that fit that. And to be honest, not only do you want to attract your target candidates, you should also be detracting the candidates that will not be the right fit.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Melissa, I love what you're saying there. I have a couple of questions and a quick thought. I mean, first of all, we talked in our podcast last week about the importance of authenticity. And I know it's something you and I very much feel the same about. And I like the message you're giving, because you're basically saying, look, it's one thing to sell or close a candidate. It's another thing to misrepresent just so during the recruiting process, they feel all warm and fuzzy because like your story with the devil, at the end of the day, what are they actually walking into? So I think that's a critical point in attracting not only people that will stay, but like you said, the right kind of people.
Yeah.
But I have a couple of questions. I want to go back to the first thing you said about a recruiting plan. And, I often comment to companies that when they promote leaders from positions of non-leadership, they don't necessarily have the requisite skills to be effective leaders unless they get training. So my question for you is, in the hiring manager HR realm, how do these people in those positions know how to build a recruiting plan? Who has ever taught them to, beyond where are we going to advertise the job posting? Who are we going to hire to recruit for us? How much are we going to pay? What does the job description look like? I mean, to me, a recruiting plan is more sophisticated than that, but do they really have the knowledge?
Well, yeah, I mean, the question, do they really have the knowledge? I think by and large, a lot of people just haven't been trained in that area, and it's not a conversation that's really a common one. I suggest starting with the company's org chart. And, if you look at the positions that are absolutely critical to have the right person in place, and what I mean is, like, through and through, they're just a fit for the company. They have the company DNA. Those core values are all in alignment. Not every single position within a company has to be an exact match on the core values and things of that sort. But there are some where you better make sure you got it right. So, if you were to look at that org chart and then, just highlight what are those positions where we've got to make sure we've got it exactly right. And then what's the succession plan? How does the succession flow? And make sure that you're hiring within the teams so that there's someone, one or two or however, whatever percentage of the team that makes sense, they can be groomed to step into that position, assuming that, you want to be pulling people up through your organization versus seeing them exit. So that's one of the first suggestions that I have. And I don't see that a lot of companies really think about recruiting plans within the context of succession planning. And I think that's the first place is don't lose your good people.
Yeah, one other follow-up question, Melissa, to that. I often think about attribution, and I'm curious to know how you feel about when you find star talent for companies and they work out, how much credit should you take? And if they don't work out, how much blame should you take, so to speak? Like, what's the attribution process you use?
Gosh, that's such a great question. I'd like to say 100% credit, 0% blame.
That's great.
But I know that's not the right answer. I think that it's always a collective. So we've seen situations where, it's not until we're 6 or 12 months into a relationship with a client where we start to really understand the reasons for some turnover and things of that sort. But I think that, as a recruiter, if you're really doing your due diligence for all of the parties, all of the interested parties, both the candidate and for the company, I really think it's the job of the recruiter to, assess as fully as possible, what are the issues within the company that can cause things to not work out in the long run, and what are the potential, flags for the candidate that can cause it to not to work out in the long run. So I think that, it's a partnership with the client, it's a partnership with the candidate, and everyone has a shared responsibility. I hope that's not a weak answer, but we're all invested in it together.
That makes a lot of sense. We spend so much time on the show talking about, how to get that top 8% level candidate, but let's go a different direction. What about the challenge of what can companies do to hedge off losing the top players they already have? Because that is always a struggle for companies. So what should they do in that case?
Yeah, I think in large part it goes back to what I was saying about culture. First things first, make sure you're fostering an environment that thrives on trust and respect. I know that sounds like a given, but still, organizations are still out there struggling with that. Beyond that, I think that companies waste a lot of time and energy coming up with benefit packages and perks and incentives and rewards. And I'm not saying it's a waste to focus on that, but it's wasteful to think that you put all of these things in place and then you're good. And in some cases, not everything you put in place is going to be meaningful to people. And beyond that, the management can't read people's minds. So they have no way of knowing what's really meaningful unless they ask. So I say, ask early, ask often. As life unfolds and priorities change for people, companies, I think, are wise to just stay in step with their employees in that way and ask what's important to them and use that as your foundation for what you build out.
Well, Melissa, I hear, I've heard a lot of CEOs get frustrated. They've communicated to me how frustrated they are that they think they do so much for their staff and they give them a great benefits plan and vacation and all this. And they begrudgingly resign themselves, but they're still not happy. And that, I think, speaks to exactly what you're saying, is that, there's multiple components that make up happiness. So, my follow-up question for you is, if there'd be something more of a fixed asset that a company can rely on, as a cornerstone foundation to help them attract and retain the top reps, what would you say it should be?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think that a company's vision and purpose holds a lot of value for employees, especially now that we have the representation of the millennial generation. They, God bless them, they're just such a mission-minded group of people that so I think that working for a company where they feel like they're able to make a real change in the world, I think that's a big deal. So if you've got that in place, like you said, Mark, you've got a cornerstone, which is great.
Well, and what I think one of the biggest challenges, Melissa, in terms of what you're saying, is that if you think about the offer itself, when someone gets an offer and they're looking at dollars and cents and benefits and vacation time and, learning opportunities, whatever, it's not like you would write on a job offer, and by the way, we have a great culture and vision here. And that's where I think companies struggle, is because it's such a nebulous thing that it's not like a tangible thing you can put on a piece of paper and the candidate's going to go, oh, well, if your culture's that, I'm taking the job. And I think it's like what I said about attribution before. It's such an easy thing to glaze over because it is an intangible. But we have heard so many people in general, and especially, like you said, the millennial generation, point to those things as critical cornerstones. So I think you're spot on.
Yeah. And you never know, Mark. There's a company I represent who they've done such a phenomenal job creating a work environment that, frankly, when I walk in the door, it feels like Disneyland. I'm like, who would not want to work here? And, one day I interviewed a woman who only worked there for 6 months, and I asked her about her experience, and she explained like she couldn't wait to get out of there. She's like, they're the weirdest people. They took an entire afternoon off and played field games in the yard and made hot dogs, and she's like, it was just creepy. And I'm like, okay.
That's great. So, all right. So we're almost out of time. So one final question is, listening to you talk about vision and purpose and things like that, how important in the grand scheme of things, when you're attracting this top tier, top 8% talent, where does it rate in the grand scheme of things?
Interesting. I think there's a common conception that a great salesperson can sell anything. And, I recently finished reading The Art of Sale by David Belstroughton, and he made a point that I had never considered before. In his decades of research, he concluded, and then I'll see if I can remember this the way that it was presented, but basically nothing matters more in sales. At the end of the day, somebody has got the right attributes, they've got training, but nothing matters more than how the salesperson perceives her role and how that act of selling either protects or inflates or undermines her sense of self. So kind of breaking that down, I think that is part of the answer to a question of mine that I've had as far as my observation of people being successful in one sales environment and then going to another where they more or less flop. And I actually say that I had that experience personally. So there was like a missing piece. And when I read Philip's work, I realized that I really think that piece of how a salesperson is perceiving what he or she is doing, I think that's really important. So that's where, the purpose and the vision definitely plays into a person's ability to be successful in sales, as long as the other criteria is met there.
Well, Melissa, I got to tell you, without being melodramatic, I think that sentence is downright compelling, because how a salesperson perceives her role and how the act of selling protects, inflates, or undermines her sense of self, to me, that sentence depicts why so many people don't like sales, right?
Yes.
Because
yes.
How they see themselves when they do their perceived act and behaving like a salesperson brings their self-esteem down. So I love that. I think, wow, I had never heard that. That's really a compelling statement. So, all right, well, Melissa, thank you so much. I mean, I think, last question for me is, everybody's looking for top tier salespeople. So if companies are looking to attract and really take advantage of your expertise and knowledge, even in a bare minimum in a consulting capacity, what's the best way to connect with you?
Oh, yeah, sure. info@franklinprofessionals.com. I'm also happy to hear from people just personally. My direct number is 508-654-6243. And what I often do is just start with, it's kind of a triage conversation, totally complimentary, and just kind of walk through the recruiting process and the challenges and, see where we can, add some value and help them to overcome their number one obstacles. So, happy to hear from anybody who might be struggling a little bit and see if I can offer up some suggestions.
All right. Well, thanks again, Melissa. And, if any of our listeners have ideas and they'd like to email us different topics that they'd like us to discuss, please do. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another edition of the Catch 'em Keep 'em podcast. And we look forward to seeing you next time. For Melissa Glenny, I'm Mark Altman. Have a good rest of the week.
Thanks for joining us on the Catch 'em and Keep 'em podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss us next time. In the meantime, remember that engaging your people is a daily task and recruiting is a process, not an event. If you need help, just ask. Connect directly with Melissa at franklinprofessionals.com and Mark at mindsetgo.com.